Historic vote in the Texas House today. Members voting to impeach Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. In a bipartisan vote, 121 members of the Texas House voted to impeach Paxton. 23 voted against impeachment. Paxton is now temporarily removed from office pending the outcome of the trial in the Texas Senate. Paxton is accused of misconduct dating back several years, and that prompted the call to remove him from office. This afternoon, a fellow Republican State House Representative Charlie Guerin says Paxton has threatened House members with retribution if they voted to impeach.
I would like to point out that several members of this House, while on the floor of this House doing the state business, received telephone calls from General Paxton personally, threatening them with political consequences in their next election.
It's not yet clear when the trial in the Senate will happen. Earlier today, we spoke with former East Texas Congressman Louie Gohmert on Paxton's possible impeachment. Gohmert ran against Paxton in the Republican primary for Texas Attorney General last year.
I was told that the reason that President Trump endorsed him is because Paxton assured him that I was not going to run against him, which, you know, if you got to lie to get somebody's endorsement, you don't deserve it. But he got it, and then Trump was very troubled later when he found out that I was actually running. He called me. But anyway, yeah, I stand by what I said. We need an uncorrupt attorney general, and we need somebody that'll stand firm on the law and pursue those that don't.
Now, meanwhile, former President Donald Trump is defending Paxton. Trump made remarks on Truth Social today. He said what's happening to Paxton is unfair, and he hopes Republicans in the State House agree. The last time a public official was impeached in Texas was back in 1975.